So it's good to be with you all again as we plunge on in Matthew's Gospel. And we come here with the beginning of chapter 21, as you're aware, to an entirely new setting in the Gospel. We were in Galilee when we began the public ministry of Jesus in chapter 4. And then the last couple of segments, we've been looking at that section of the Gospel between chapter 16 and chapter 20, where Jesus and his disciples are moving towards Jerusalem. And we noted the Passion predictions. We noted some of the focus on discipleship and last week, looking in a particular way at Matthew's view of the church in chapter 18, the community discourse, and in other segments, sort of a summary there. We took the time to do a little summary. Now, the mood and the setting change somewhat dramatically as we enter in chapter 21 in Matthew's narrative into Jerusalem, and in a particular way into its temple. And all of the scenes in this section from chapter 21 through chapter 25 are either in the temple or in conflicts surrounding the temple area, or finally on the Mount of Olives looking across at the temple. And we know, of course, that, as we'll reflect a little bit, the temple, of the centrality of that within Judaism. And so here we have, in a sense, three segments we want to try to look at. It's a lot of material, and so some of it we'll deal with in more summary fashion with your indulgence. We have the entry into the temple and this prophetic action of Jesus in the temple that is such prominence in all of the Gospels. And then there's this series of conflicts, like final conflicts with the whole array of the opponents of Jesus, taking place in the setting of the temple, the place of orthodoxy for Judaism, the center of its worship and its handing on of its traditions. And then finally, beginning in chapter 24, Matthew takes his cue from Mark's Gospel, from the so-called Apocalyptic discourse in Mark chapter 13. We think about the destiny of the community, the destiny of the world, final judgment, a motif that's very important for Matthew's theology. So we have these three scenes, if you like, the entry and cleansing or purification, whatever we want to call that, and then the whole series of conflicts, and then finally the apocalyptic discourse of chapters 24 and 25. Matthew draws this from Mark's Gospel. We've noted this now for some time, that he's sort of following the sequence. Mark parallel is chapters 11 and 12, the entry into the temple and a series of conflicts as well, and then chapter 13 in Mark, the apocalyptic discourse. But Matthew, characteristically, as we've seen throughout his gospel, draws on the saying source that he has, and he has a lot of his own material that he adds to the mix, especially some parables. And especially when he adds these parables, it's on the motif of judgment, as we'll see. So let's take them up in sequence, and just if we work along with this and try to sort of draw the cream off, if we can, from Matthew's theology. And starting with the entry into the temple. And we recall, and we're familiar with this, that the temple, of course, such a prominent role, both in Judaism and in earliest Christianity. We'll take a little bit of that up later. The early Christians had to deal with the temple, even in its absence. It was such a powerful unifying symbol for Israel, the place of its cult, the sole place of its cult. There had been in the course of history a couple of other temples in Egypt, for example, and earlier, in the very early Israelite period, there were some local shrines. Eventually, under David and Solomon, those were suppressed, and the centralization of the cult in Jerusalem, along with the political centralization in Jerusalem as the capital, gave to that place its great historical significance and its great symbolic power that still, in a way, remains. Everyone who considers this passage that we have here at the beginning of chapter 21 in Matthew's text down to verse 17 and their parallels in the Synoptics and in John senses that this was probably, on the level of the history of Jesus, the significant catalyst that galvanized the opposition against him and would lead most immediately to his arrest and his condemnation. In the Synoptics, it comes here in this climactic part of Jesus' mission. The Gospel of John, you recall, puts it at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, right after his first sign in Cana of Galilee. Then he goes up to Jerusalem, and there's also the purification of the temple. But John, although having this very different sequence of events, links the cleansing of the temple to the death of Jesus. Jesus, in his own words, say, "Destroy this body. In 3 days I will build it up." And it says he was referring to his death and resurrection, the narrative there. So all of them see this as linked in some way. And there's a lot of discussions, what is the context for this? That it's not simply dealing with abuses, some kind of cheating going on or too much commerce, too many souvenirs and so on in the temple area. But more significantly, it could be a claim for religious authority, because there were Jewish traditions that in the Messianic age, the Temple of Jerusalem would be pulled down and purified and a new temple built. It's a little bit vague whether this was the Messiah who actually does this or not. But this notion of the transformation, the rebuilding, the establishment of a new temple was in more than one Jewish tradition. I put on your notes the work of Donald Jewell there, Messiah and Temple, that he really goes over a lot of that, and so does Nicholas Perrin in his book, Jesus, the Temple. There's a lot of writing about this because it's such a rich motif. And we know also that added to the mix, that this is at the Passover time as the Synoptics present it, as also John going up for the festival. We know that Judea and Samaria, these two very important provinces or regions of Judaism, of Israel at the time of Jesus, were under direct Roman rule. And they had been since the time of Archelaus, the son of Herod, who was deposed, who originally, on the death of Herod the Great, was given that territory, but was so cruel and inept, he was removed by the Romans, and they directly rule Jerusalem and its surroundings, Judea. And that heightens the tension, if you like. We know that the Romans gave crowd control, if you like, or keeping order. They entrusted that to the priestly establishment. It's almost like today, on the Temple Mount, the state of Israel, even though it would claim that this is part of Israel territory, it's the Waqf, it's the Muslim council that controls, keeps order on top of the Temple Mount, unless there's a crisis, and then, as there just were a few days ago, where the troops enter in to the temple compound, to the area there on top of the Temple Mount. But the same was true in Roman times. And so, we had talked earlier about the work of Horsley, Richard Horsley, that he calls it the temple state, run by the elite in, coordination with the Romans, but the Jewish authorities, the senior priestly families and elders were responsible for maintaining order. And of course, you have the famous statement in John's Gospel of Caiaphas that, if we let this guy go on like this, the Romans will come in and destroy our sanctuary. So it's better one man die for the people. So, people looking from the point of view of the historical Jesus, we're looking at it from Matthew's point of view, see that the drama set here is a drama that is fraught with danger. And it is also the statements about the temple and critiques of the temple. There is a context for that in Judaism that claims that this is something to be expected in the Messianic age. So Jesus taking upon himself this dramatic stopping of the, sort of the ordinary commerce of the temple. A lot of this was necessary because you couldn't bring Roman coins into there, and you had to, exchange to get animals and grains and so on for the sacrifice. But it's the drama of it, disrupting it and attacking it, critiquing it, is part of the Jewish tradition. And it was compounded by the fact that Herod built this temple. And Herod the Great was not considered a model of religious integrity. So it had, even though there was a lot of pride taken in the dimensions of this temple, it was also, there was an unease among religiously sensitive Jews. So Matthew and Mark, it's very interesting, and we won't spend a lot of time on this, but maybe if you had looked at Mark chapter 11, there's sort of a strange setting that Mark does. Jesus, like in Matthew, there's the entry. We'll look at Matthew's text because he amplifies the story of the entry. But Jesus comes in to Jerusalem, comes into the temple, and it says he looked around and then leaves, and goes back. It's like Cecil B. DeMille has the cameras running. We're all ready for this. And he says, oh, it's late, so we'll do this, take this tomorrow. And the reason most people think is that Mark wanted to frame the action in the temple with the story of the fig tree. On the way into the temple the next day, Jesus sees the fig tree that's not bearing any fruit, and he curses it. You have the action in the temple, and then when they're coming out of the temple, on the way back, they see that the fig tree has withered. So in Mark's theology, and this has been studied quite a bit, there's a much more radical view here. He doesn't let anybody take anything through the temple in Mark's text. And you have this sense that the fig tree serves as a condemnation of the temple itself. And that Mark, in his passion story, the accusation against Jesus is destroy this temple made by hands, and in 3 days I will build another temple not made by hands. So Mark, in a more of a Roman context, if you like, a Gentile context, sees the action of Jesus as foreshadowing the very end of the temple economy, if you like, the economy in a religious sense. The temple system and structure will be replaced by Jesus, the cornerstone. He's on to a tradition that we'll see in other texts that you have, like in Ephesians or 1 Peter or in Paul himself, where the Christian community is the temple. But in Matthew's text, anticipating what his theology is, he does not seem to critique the temple as such. It's the temple of God. He doesn't use this terminology of made by hands, not made by hands. He doesn't have the fig trees withering symbolize the end of the temple. And again, this is part of this subtle but we've seen it so often, the Jewish sensitivities of Matthew. He's much more like Luke here. You know, Luke, Jesus begins in the temple in the infancy narrative, and he ends in the temple, and there's the worship of the community going to the temple daily in the early chapters of Acts. Luke, even though he's certainly ambivalent about Jerusalem, both crucifies Jesus, but it's also the heart of the Jewish experience. And so Luke respects the temple. It is still the temple of God. And Matthew is similar. The problem for Matthew is not the temple, it's the leaders. It's the religious leaders who have made it a den of thieves, who have violated the temple. And because of their sinfulness, the temple will be destroyed ultimately. But it's not, in a sense, the fault of the temple. It's the fault of the leadership, which has been a constant refrain in Matthew's gospel, as we know. So look back now at the text, sort of anticipating what's going on here. You have the triumphant entry, much as Mark has staged it. It's interesting that, you know, I always get tempted to dwell on these little brush strokes, but it takes up our time. Those of you that have been at Bethany, where a CTU program is in Bethany, you go up the hill a little bit and you come to Bethpage. Mark doesn't seem aware of that. He puts Bethpage before Bethany, you know. So, but Matthew drops the reference to Bethany so that Jesus' last stop on the way up the Mount of Olives is accurately Bethpage. I think Matthew knew this terrain. And so he goes, you have the preparation to go and get a donkey tied with a colt and bring it to him. And of course here is where Matthew interjects another fulfillment quotation. And as we've seen that this is something characteristic of him, this is in verse 4, what was fulfilled, spoken through the prophet, saying, this is a quote from Zephaniah chapter 9, verse 9, which speaks of the liberation of Jerusalem with the Lord's Messiah coming. It comes at the very end of Zechariah, this text. And your king is coming to you humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And they go and they bring it to him. And of course, this leads to one of the curiosities of Matthew, where having quoted this, in a sense, almost a literal fulfillment, he says, they brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. So here's the first miracle, Jesus sitting on two animals here. And this has been discussed, you know, at length. Most people think that the quote of Zephaniah, a donkey on a colt, the foal of a donkey, is really sort of a Hebrew parallelism, that it's one animal, okay? You know, it's like you have this a lot in the Psalms where the phrase is repeated, so it's a donkey that happens to be the foal of a donkey, a colt. But Matthew's text takes it as two animals, you know. There's a literal fulfillment here, and Jesus sits on both of them. You don't have this in Mark. That's a change in Mark. But what's really more important is, what is Matthew asserting here? This, as Mark is too, this is the triumphant entry. This is the Messiah coming to claim his city and to claim the house of God. And what Matthew adds is affirming that, but also speaking, he picks up on the idea, which is not the case in Mark, that Jesus is mounted on a donkey. You know, this is a symbol of humility. This is a king like no other that's coming in. This is the triumphant possession of the city, but it's done in a way that all the way through the gospel we've seen Jesus, in a sense, subverting, if you like, or transforming these traditional symbols. And here he is the Messiah, the king, the anointed one, but he is the humble one. We had this in chapter 15 of Matthew, had it in chapter 11. You know, come to me, and the beauty, the humility of Jesus. And then, of course, you have the reaction of the crowds to him. And one of the things Matthew adds to Mark is in verse 10. when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil. Literally, the word used here is from seismography, seismic, semeste. The city was shaken. Okay, it's turmoil, I guess, is a way to describe this. But seismos, the root word we use as well, is what is used here. And people compare it to, in chapter 2, verse 3, when the Magi come to find out from Herod and his court and the people of Jerusalem where the Messiah is born. It says there that they're amazed, they're shaken. It's not the same word used here, but it's the same concept. There's reverberations here, fear, something that's happening, a trembling of the Messiah coming. And so what you have when you look at this in a sense is we're having various reactions, There's the people who are, a large crowd, like in verse 8. They're cutting the branches. They're shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David. Jerusalem itself is in turmoil. There's this sorting out. You start to have the anticipation of what's going to happen in the Passion story. And you have the children, later, below, after the cleansing, the children will cry out in amazement and in joy at Jesus. But the leaders take offense, it says. They are angry. They're indignant. So you start to have this array of responses that we've seen this gamut before in the gospel. And the crowd saying, the whole city was in turmoil asking, who is this? This is verses 10 and 11. The crowds are saying, this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee. And then you have the prophetic action itself in the temple. And as you know, Matthew's story is much more dramatic because Jesus enters into the city, there's reaction, and he enters right into the temple. This is the dramatic procession is not truncated as it is in Mark's text. And he does these things of, disrupting the temple commerce, if you like. And he quotes this text from Isaiah, my house shall be called a house of prayer. This is already in Mark, but you are making a den of thieves. And then there's something else Matthew adds that's always been intriguing to me, and that's verse 14. Okay? The blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he cured them. And this, of course, you think of a text, the Leviticus chapter 21. There's an infamous text about the people with disabilities not able to enter into the temple enclosure. You have working here, there's a book I just have come across, been asked to review for a journal on it's looking again at all of the taboos and the symbolism in the biblical world surrounding people with physical disabilities, whether it's, blindness or not being able to hear, or not being able to walk, or with flows of blood. And this notion that somehow, we do it in our own society, of course, if somebody has a kind of very evident physical disability, that's often connected, disability is connected with feeling that the person has a lower human capacity, or even that there's some kind of evil or curse associated with it. People have these attitudes. A lot of friends that I had the chance to be with speak of a severely able-bodied person, who has this attitude of, they just can't, they're very patronizing, or they're assuming that somebody who has a disability is somehow less a human being, or they identify them with their disability. This book I'm reading calls it ableism. It's a kind of ideology. And this is what is so interesting about this text, because Leviticus chapter 21, I'll just read this quickly to you. The Lord said to Moses, a famous text, and people working in this area know it only too well. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and say, no one of your offspring throughout their generations who has a blemish may approach to offer the food of his God. For no one who has a blemish shall draw near, one who is blind or lame, or one who has a mutilated face or a limb too long, or one who has a broken foot or a broken hand, or a hunchback or a dwarf, or a man with a blemish in his eyes, or an itching disease, or scabs or crushed testicles. No descendant of Aaron the priest who has a blemish shall come near to offer the Lord's offerings by fire, since he has a blemish. He shall not come near to offer the food of his God. He may eat the food of his God, the most holy as well as of the holy, but he shall not come near the curtain or approach the altar, because he has a blemish, that he may not profane my sanctuaries, for I am the Lord, I sanctify them." It's very powerful text of exclusion. It goes back to this whole notion that temple was the fullness of life, and to access to the temple you have to have any sign of death purged from you. So people, the assumption here is that people with these kind of physical ailments are somehow cursed, they're somehow less than human in some way, they're a blemish, and so they're excluded. And in this text, Jesus brings them into the temple. And I can only connect it with the healing stories that we had in 8 and 9 and other places where, the leper coming or the others that Jesus, the intention of connection with them. I talked to that point when we're reflecting on it, that the mission of healing is to heal the community. It's part of the whole gathering of Israel, the many coming from east and west, that Matthew sees as the rationale for the powerful healing, the transformation of a community that is broken and crushed, and giving them access. And here this is carried into the temple in a text that can hardly be anything less than very deliberate, to add this to the account. It's you're thinking of it. So for Matthew, the people are, he's assembling them and transforming the temple. It's not a den of thieves. It's the place where Israel comes, so the people are praising this, and the children are crying out, the children who understand the kingdom of God, and so on. So this is a very powerful text here. And you have, as I said, the response of people. The children are claiming, but in verse 15, when the chief priests and the scribes saw the amazing things he did and heard the children crying out in the temple, they became angry, Anakanao, they became indignant, And do you hear what these are saying? And Jesus said to them, yes, have you never read, out of the mouths of infants and nursing babes, you have prepared praise for yourself. He left them and went out of the city to Bethany and spent the night there. So here, what Mark had put, at the very beginning when Jesus just walked into the temple, then left, Matthew has it here after this powerful action. So this scene for Matthew, I think, is he heightens the tension. He heightens both the affirmation of Jesus' authority, and we'll see that comes in verse 23, the question about his authority. But this is a very important and dramatic scene, particularly, again, because of the Jewish sensitivities of the evangelist, of Matthew. The cursing of the fig tree that follows this is found already in Mark's text. It's enigmatic. Some, critics look at this and wonder if it originally was a parable. There's a parable in Luke about the fig tree not bearing fruit, and you dig around and put manure on it, and it, begins to blossom. But whether that was the origin of this, and now it becomes actually story of Jesus dealing with the fig tree. But I think that Matthew is not having that kind of sensitivity or the tradition. I think that this was a story circulating about Jesus. And now that it's not framing the story of the temple, and this is what I think a number of interpreters have said. Well, this text becomes a commentary on the leaders, the religious leaders. This notion of not bearing fruit is, remember we saw this earlier in Matthew's Gospel. I put the text there in chapter 7, verse 16 to 20 at the end of every good tree bears good fruit, every bad tree bears bad fruit. This is also from Jeremiah chapter 8. This is a motif. So here, this tree, it's not, in Mark you have this thing, wasn't the season for figs. Matthew doesn't include that. This is simply a tree that's failed. It's not bearing fruit, and so it's cursed, okay? There has nothing on it but leaves. May no fruit ever come from you, and it withers at once. And so this is, we had earlier at the end of, we have coming up, in chapter 21, verse 43, about the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruits of the kingdom. Okay. So this consistently in Matthew, it's the failure of the leaders. And we're going to have chapter 23 coming up where they're indicted for their hypocrisy and lack of integrity. So this whole scene then that comes to a close in a way with verse 22 is one of the most dramatic parts of Matthew's story, the entry into Jerusalem. And I think of Luke as an alternate way. If you remember in Luke in chapter 19, Jesus comes up the same path, Bethany, Bethpage, over the Mount of Olives. He sees the city and he weeps for the city. It's a very powerful scene. But I think each of the evangelists sense that this is one of those moments, of Jesus seeing this heart of his community and all of the sadness and tragedy that is connected to it. This next major segment that we have there, as I put on your, from 21:23 to 22:46, it's like one of these, if you were a wrestling fan when you were a kid, the tag team matches, where the different opponents get in and the Darth Vader, whoever he is, throws them all out one by one. Well, that's what the scene is like. The opponents of Jesus step into the ring and he throws them all out in turn. But it's the basis of the whole series that is coming here, and I've listed them, the conflicts, is in verse 23. If you see that, when he entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching. And we have to understand the scene. He's in the temple. He's teaching. This is the center of orthodoxy, the source of Jewish tradition and cult, and said, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" This is one of those questions that sort of lingers in the air. This is the question of the gospel. And again, Jesus responding to them, we've seen this kind of sequence. He goes back to John the Baptist. You remember in chapter 11, John the Baptist came on the scene at the beginning of the conflict stories. John the Baptist was the forerunner of Jesus. As he entered into his public mission, he was handed over, and Jesus comes. We learn about the execution of John as a harbinger of Jesus' own execution. And here, again, he cites John the Baptist. They rejected him. You can think of chapter 11, verse 18. You're like the children in the marketplace. We sang you a dirge, you did not wail. We piped you a tune, you did not dance. John the Baptist came neither eating or drinking. You say he is insane. So here again, the rejection of John is a harbinger of the rejection of Jesus and reveals the insincerity of the leaders. There's a whole string of parables. If you look at that list, there's just a couple I'd like to point to. Particularly the parable of the two sons is only found in Matthew's Gospel. And you couldn't find a better summary of his theology of you know, what really counts is what you do, not what you say. So the father, you know, I will go, says to the second son. The sequence of these are altered in various manuscripts, but this one here, the New Revised Standard, has the first son says no, but later changed his mind. The second one says yes, but doesn't go. Okay, and Jesus said when he's asked them which did the will of the Father, they have to concede the first, who first said no, but then went anyway. And truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came in the way of dikaiosune, righteousness, and you did not believe him, but the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him, and even after you saw that, you did not change your minds and believe him. So that parable, it just, you know, condenses Matthew's whole theology of action, of it's what you do, not what you say, and this also continues the indictment of the leaders that is so much to the surface in this part of the gospel. The other one, there's a correction on your notes, by the way, under the parable of the vineyard there. That should be 21:43, not 46, if you want to make that change. That's what Matthew adds to this parable, the parable of the wicked tenants. He jazzes up the violence against the messengers, but the key part comes, Mark has the quote from Psalm 118, the stone that the builders reject has become the cornerstone. But Matthew adds this conclusion: therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces the fruits of the kingdom. And you remember the discussion. This is one of these key texts that has often been cited as indicating the turn from the Jews to the Gentiles. So the interpretation, often a traditional interpretation, is that taken away from you, you means Israel, you know, and given to a people to produce the fruits means the Gentiles. But in more recent interpretation, it really takes its cue. Look at the next verse, verse 45. When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parable, they realized he was speaking about them, about the leaders, not about Israel as such. You know, this is not a rejection of the people of Israel. This is a rejection of the leaders who all along have, in Matthew's portrayal of them, have shown bad faith. And they wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds because they regarded him as a prophet. So in other words, instead of this being Israel, Gentiles, it's people who don't respond and people who do respond. It's an intra-Jewish context, if you like. And the same criteria that Matthew has given us over and over. It's what you do that defines you. The other thing in the fourth note here, just about the parable of the wedding banquet, what Matthew adds is verse 11. Okay. It's the man who's not wearing a wedding garment. Okay. I think this is always confusing in this story. This is unfair. My God, the guy didn't have time to rent a tuxedo or anything, and why is he? And you know, people who have interpreted this, I think it's Matthew's consistency, and we'll see it burst into flame in his whole context about judgment. It's accountability, you know. There's no exception. The leaders of Israel fail, but the Gentiles can fail too, or other people invited can fail. So the wedding garment, you have to have a transformed life in order to participate in this setup. And it also, both these parables, the wicked tenants and the parable of the wedding feast, some have observed, reflects Matthew's view of a mixed world. Remember in the parable discourse, we saw the wheat and the weeds was Matthew's text, and we saw the fish, the net, the story of the net, where there's many fish, some good, some bad. And, so he lives in a world of mixed responses. And it's this world that the community has to deal with. And so I put there those references to those two texts. There comes a whole string here of parables and incidents, conflict stories, and the whole through chapter 22, paying taxes to Caesar, the question about resurrection with the Sadducees, the question about the greatest commandment of the law. In Mark's gospel in chapter 12, this is not a conflict story. It's a scribe who is seeking the kingdom of God comes to Jesus. And he hears Jesus speaking, and Jesus answers, what is the greatest commandment? He says, well said, teacher. It's a very beautiful story. Jesus says to him, you are not far from the kingdom of God. Matthew alters it and puts it in a string of conflict stories. And the leaders try to trip him up. In verse 34, the Pharisees heard he had silenced the Sadducees. They gathered together and a lawyer in order to test him. Okay, this is not found in Mark in chapter 12. It's a very beautiful story in Mark. And here the ending is different too. In Mark, the scribe, who is dazzled by Jesus' answer, at the end says, you answer rightly, and this means that to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself, is more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. Okay. So this response of the love command is superior to the cultic obligations. But in Matthew, he pulls it back in to interpretation of law in verse 40. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So it becomes, the heart of the love command. We've seen this all the way through in the Sermon on the Mount, and this is Matthew's assertion here powerfully. So what happens at the end of this section, if you look down in verse 46, chapter 22, verse 46, no one was able to give him an answer, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. Okay. So we sort of crossed the Rubicon here. This is the last blast of the opponents. The next thing we will encounter them, it will be as they arrest Jesus and the Passion story. But the conflicts, chapter 23 follows where Jesus speaks to the disciples and denounces the leaders in these very bitter terms. But as far as Jesus, interacting with the leaders, that's over now. It finishes here at the end of chapter 22. So, we've talked about this before. This is a very tough part of Matthew's gospel. This bitter denunciation and excoriation, really, of the religious leaders, reflecting, certainly in part, conflicts of Jesus with his contemporaries, but amplified and given an edge by the conflict between Matthew's Jewish Christian community and the majority Jewish community he's interacting with, and also serving as a warning, if you like, correction within the Matthean community of authentic leadership versus hypocritical leadership. And we saw that in chapter 23, the denunciation of the scribes and Pharisees then turns to the disciples, call no one rabbi, you're to avoid places of honor, that part that comes in chapter 23, verse 8 and following. So the example of the scribes and Pharisees and the other leaders is also meant as instruction to Matthew's own community about authentic leadership within the community. The final segment there on page 2 of your notes, and I know this is sort of squeezing things in, but just so for the sake of we would not be doing Matthew justice if we didn't say a few things about this. And this is what you have at the beginning of chapter 24, the apocalyptic discourse. It takes place as the setting there is 24:1. They come out of the temple, going away. His disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. And you see all these, do you not tell it? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here upon another, all will be torn down. And when he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples come to him. So you know, the setting is, it's about the temple now, from outside the temple. They've been in the temple the whole time. And now it's on the Mount of Olives, the place, traditional place of judgment, associated with judgment in the scriptures, and the last judgment. And looking across the Kidron Valley at the temple prompts this reflection, this discourse on the final age of the world. And Matthew uses Mark 13. He's already borrowed some of Mark 13 for the mission discourse in chapter 10. You remember the discussions in the chapter 10 of Matthew that spoke about the turmoil and so on that would afflict the community. He stole that from Mark 13 already, but then he rejoins the rest of Mark 13 here. And it also is using a whole series of, Jewish apocalyptic literature. There's a lot of stock items here. Earthquakes and travails and divisions in family and community, and the mountains falling, and this is the end of a world. Apocalyptic in Judaism, pure apocalyptic, is very dualistic. It sees the end of the current world and the creation of a new world. In most of Christian literature that emerges from this, borrowing from Jewish apocalyptic, you have sort of a modified apocalyptic. In other words, there's a travail of the world, but out of it is born a new world. But in pure apocalyptic terms, these dramatic rhetoric is feeling that, as people say, it comes out of a sense of hope and despair. Despair about the present age, hope that God will recreate a new world, like the end of the book of Revelation. The new Jerusalem comes down to renew the earth that has been soaked in blood and chaos. So the destruction of the temple is associated with the travails that come with the advent of the Messianic age. And so when Jesus sits on the Mount of Olives in Matthew's presentation and speaks about the end of the world, all of this is very Jewish. It's very much of a literature coming out of an age of chaos. What you have, I tried to summarize, realizing we had a lot of stuff here, that what are the major motifs? Some of these are found in Mark, but Matthew has his own emphasis. Very important is the notion of staying awake. Okay? The Greek word gregorein, Gregory, that is found also strongly in Mark and in gregorein, to stay awake, gregoreta. And this is coupled with a suppression of apocalyptic enthusiasm. Okay? In other words, the Christian, there's like three components that are in Mark, and I try to put them in there in a sense, particularly in the third part. But there's being wary about false prophecy. Some will say, here he is, or here he is, don't believe them. There's repeated in here as it is in Mark. So apocalyptic enthusiasm of people that are foreshortening the time. There's warnings about that. Don't believe them. They say, is he? They're false prophets and false prophecy. On the other hand, there's supposed to be an alertness in history. you're wide awake. You're not sleeping. And Matthew will define being wide awake as doing good deeds. Okay? It's the parable he has about the steward. The master goes on a trip, and the steward, thinking the master's not coming, starts to beat and, mess over the slaves in the household. But he's supposed to be doing good. You are alert by being true to the teaching of Jesus in the midst of this. Your lamps are lit, the wise and foolish virgins. Your talents, you're utilizing the talents. All of these are encouragement of ongoing integrity, activity, which is the alertness for the coming of the Son of Man. And on the third part that's very fundamental, is both in Mark and Matthew, the mission has to continue until the end of time. Okay? So, what's interesting, these are called apocalyptic discourses, but actually they're kind of anti-apocalyptic. In other words, the community in a time of travail is not to withdraw from the world, it's to continue its mission. In Matthew, you have it there strongly, to continue the gathering and continue the work within, the world until the end. And the mission 24:14 is the verse that's particularly important. It's parallel to Mark chapter 13, verse 10. And this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Okay? So the end, the gospel has to be proclaimed throughout the world, and the end comes. So I think this is very important, even pastorally. A lot of times this material is hijacked, and it's used to focus on when the Son of Man is coming and the lack of responsibility for the world. That's the way a lot of Christian interpretations of this text have come, where in fact this text is working against that translation, that interpretation. Saying one must remain active, alert, invested, continuing the mission, acting with integrity, even though the world is in chaos. And look at, there's a very beautiful expression that's found only in Matthew. It's in verse 12. When he speaks about the false prophets, he adds, because of the increase of lawlessness, this is one of Matthew's sins, anomia. Nomos means law. Anomia is lawlessness. So, his interpretation of law, doing good deeds. And the love of many will grow cold. Okay? This is Matthew's text. That, in a sense, is lawlessness. Okay? Because for Matthew, the love command is the animating driver of human action. As we saw in the Sermon on the Mount and already saw in this, on this hangs the law and the prophets. So for love to grow cold, and anomia is, in a sense, the same thing. So Matthew is, again, urging his community to be true to themselves, to be involved. And then the other thing that's also in Mark, I think, is very beautiful. Mark's gospel never uses the word judgment, krisis. Matthew does use judgment in some of his parables. But as I'll explain in a moment, there's the one scene of the sheep and the goats. But in the text where it describes the coming of the Son of Man, the end action of the Son of Man is a gathering. Okay? Gathers the elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other, in chapter 24, verse 31. You have that in Mark also. So in a sense, the scenario is the gospel is proclaimed to the whole world. The Son of Man comes and then gathers everyone from the four winds and the corners of the earth. Okay. And as I put there, the stance of the community, alertness, doing good in accord with the commands of Jesus. Some interpreters of Matthew have said, when you look at the whole shebang here, from chapter 23, then chapter 24 and half of 25, and then the final parable, the sheep and the goats, that really you're looking at, in the view of the gospel, successive judgments, successive accountabilities. The leaders are condemned in chapter 23, they're indicted for their hypocrisy and so on. The community is warned in chapter 24 and the beginning of chapter 25 about being alert, about being invested in the world, about doing good. And the last parable, one of the most famous ones in Matthew's Gospel, 25, 31 to 46, the sheep and the goats. If you look at that, it's when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all his angels, all the nations, this is the ethnoi, okay? And some have said the original sense of this, as it's in Matthew's Gospel, ethnoi, the nations, the peoples, that, we interpret this parable, and rightly so, as a beautiful criteria of how we will be judged by God. And we're judged by Matthew's consistent message of, care for those in need, the vulnerable. This is the Sermon on the Mount translated into a scene of judgment. This is the love command illustrated. This is what we've seen, this consistency in Matthew. And so this beautiful criteria, the people that don't even know who the Son of Man is, but they did the right thing. It's like the two sons parable. But there's a real consistent ethical reflection in Matthew as accountability. But what Matthew may have in mind with this parable, in sort of its first layer, is not a general ethical principle, but he's talking, how will the nations be judged? Who don't even know Jesus. And they will be judged on how they deal with the least. And interpreters, I think, rightly say, who are the least in this scene? The least, whatever you do, the least of my brethren, you do to me. Okay? And the least here are the Christians, the missionaries, the Christian missionaries, the people that are going out. You have in chapter 10, he refers to them as the least, what you do to these little ones. So you give a cup of water to the least of my brethren, you give it to me. And so the nations are being judged not on their involvement yet in the community, but in their instinctive goodness to treat these vulnerable witnesses that come wandering into their town. If they offer them a cup of water, if they give them the shirt on their back, if they visit them in prison, they are going to enter into the kingdom of God. There's a book on this text by Russell Prejant, and it's called Christology Beyond Dogma. Okay? And his point is that this parable, in a sense of Matthew, runs right off the track. Okay? You have a confessional context in the first two groups of, the Jewish leaders should know better, the religious leaders. The members of the community should know better, that they should be faithful and alert. The nations, what do they know? They don't know Jesus yet, but they do have a chance to respond with their best instincts, their best human instincts. And if they have innately this kind of love and kindness, they will be the sheep and not the goats. I don't know if that makes sense. It's a little different way of looking at this parable, but it's, Matthew's community is about to wander out into the world. And it's almost like a kind of, what would you say, a natural theology here at work. The way we can think of, how do we think about the peoples who don't know Christ? What is their means of salvation? What is their indicators of humanity? And I think of this, in the Pope's joy of the gospel, he has a section in the end on peacemaking. And he talks about the bridge building. And one of the bridge buildings is between people of faith and people of goodwill. Okay? He says it's like faith and reason. In other words, there should be an alliance between people of faith and people of goodwill for the sake of humanity and for the sake of quelling violence and promoting human flourishing. And I think of this, that's a way this, the sheep and the goats could be understood. Pope Benedict himself was very strong on this, he gave an address to the European Parliament, shortly after he was elected Pope, and spoke about acting as if, do you remember hearing that? He spoke to them and said, we could find common ground if we can act as if we could act as if we're all children of one family. We could act as if, that peace and goodwill makes us flourish as human beings. So he was trying to find like a common ground between people who have, of faith, of explicit faith, and people who have good human instincts and trying to follow them. So anyway, this section of the gospel, on judgment, I put there just in these conclusions, the temple, as I just summarized there, that for Matthew, the problem is the religious leaders' sins that lead to the destruction of the temple, not the temple itself. I think that's, he calls it the temple of God. And then Matthew's view of salvation history and the determining factor of doing God's will. This is what sorts us out, to do God's will, and God's will are, illustrated in the gospel with the love command and with these deeds of justice and mercy and good faith. And then his concern with eschatology and judgment. Just to say, and we'll pick up some of this in the Passion account too, because Matthew emphasizes ethical response so strongly as a way of, evidencing the sincerity of our faith, because of the emphasis on doing good, accountability and responsibility become strong. Okay, so if this, and it's a Jewish tradition on doing justice and living the covenant. It's what you do, not what you say. It's how you walk, halakha. So if the emphasis is there, then there's a human responsibility to act rightly. Okay? And judgment is a rhetoric that calls the community to accountability. There are consequences for your actions, and maybe ultimate consequences. So the ethical principle that Matthew is using here so often to determine who belongs and who doesn't, who follows the will of God and who doesn't, also leads, I think, to this focus on judgment that's so strong here in this section of the gospel. So it's a lot of stuff to cover, but I think there's a certain coherence here. As this is the final confrontation between Jesus and his opponents. It's the final set of the teachings of Jesus, exhortations about what defines a child of God in his perspective, and we're set now for the denouement, for the passion and resurrection of Jesus, in which a lot of these motifs work their way into it. But this, in a sense, is sort of the finale of the ministry of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew.